Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 8. Our learning outcomes for this unit include to assess empires in collision, empires that end up kind of coming into contact with each other in a rough and tumble sort of way. We will start with the Ottoman Empire, which surrounds modern-day Turkey and expanded all across and surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, especially on the east side, north and south. And Europe, which of course is not a European empire, several different nations became extremely powerful empires in their own right, and we will see how they managed to control other parts of the world, including major chunks of the Ottoman Empire, which disintegrates by the beginning of World War I, and East Asia. And our focus for East Asia for this unit will be China and Japan. Our time frame starts all the way back in the 1500s and goes all the way through 1914 through the beginning of World War I. Our focus, however, will be the 18th and 19th, or more like 19th and early 20th centuries. So the 1800s and the early 1900s. And our focus question and what we will be kind of comparing for this unit is China and Japan. Our ID words, map IDs, and timeline items are always in the beginning of the PowerPoint for you to reference. And our focus question, which we will look at in just a moment, focusing on comparing China to Japan and how they responded to Europeans in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is an image of the Ottoman Empire. The dates shown here are from 1451 till 1566. And you can see right here is Constantinople, which was renamed Istanbul. And this is the Mediterranean Sea. And up here is Europe. And down here is Africa. And on the east side is the Middle East, to put it into kind of more context. And you can see how the Ottoman Empire kind of encompasses the Mediterranean Sea and takes over and took over many parts of other territories, including the Byzantine Empire and parts of the Roman Empire way back in the day. It actually expanded more than this later on and then shrunk back to just Turkey, which is right here, modern-day Turkey. So the Ottoman Empire was kind of considered the strong sword of Islam from at least 1453, which is when Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, up through the 19th century, through the 1800s. When Mehmed II again conquered Constantinople, he changed the name to Istanbul to represent and to show his significant power over the former Christian entity, stronghold. And towards 1750 and up until the 19th century, the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was the great power of the Islamic world. There were a series of military successes against Europe, and many viewed the Ottomans as the great defender of Islam, of the Muslim world. Europeans even treated the empire with both awe and respect, which is kind of interesting because Europeans generally throughout history have thought that they were the greatest and most wonderful of all humans, as most people think that they are. But this all changed in the 19th century when the Ottomans faced a world that had been changed dramatically with Western industrialization. And again, I'm sure you all remember, but industrialization began in the late 18th century, in the mid to late 1700s, and greatly developed by the 19th century, the 1800s. So Europe became extremely powerful, and the Ottoman Empire didn't grow in the same type of way. The Ottoman Empire also had increasingly difficult economic situations with changing global economic orders. And it became known as sort of the sick man of Europe by the late 18th century, by the late 1700s. And what the changing global economic order meant was that the European shipping in the Atlantic and Indian and Pacific Oceans really decreased the flow of trade through the Persian Gulf and Red Sea and other Ottoman trade routes. Let's take a look back at those waterways here. The Red Sea here, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean Sea, and instead people were going around the Ottoman Empire to avoid paying the taxes through here. So the Ottoman Empire really suffered in that way. And also, we had cheaper manufactured imports from Europe thanks to industrialization. Machines made things much cheaper, and this left the Ottoman economy and products lacking in the ability to compete. Without the amount and the quantity and quality of products to sell, this left a hole in taxes, and that led the state to take out loans it could not pay back. What happened was, foreigners stepped in, Europeans in particular, and took over sections of the economy with loans and with buying companies out that were failing. And eventually, Europeans started taking chunks out of the Ottoman Empire itself. The British, for example, took Egypt and its wealth in 1882, and Egypt was a pretty wealthy and powerful territory among the Ottoman Empire states. After the French invasion of Egypt after Napoleon in 1798 and its subsequent de facto independence, various European powers chipped off more and more territory, and land was lost to Russia, France, Britain, and Austria. So all of these foreign superpowers were chipping away chunks of territory from the Ottoman Empire. And this is nothing new. We saw this in Africa. We started to see this in Southeast Asia, and we will see this more in the main chunk of Asia, in China and in Japan, in a few minutes. In this weak state, the empire that had once been a defender of the Muslim faith was unable to challenge Christian states that were seizing control over Muslim territories. And the Ottomans, the former strong sword of Islam, they were unable to defend and protect Muslims everywhere, all the way from Indonesia in Southeast Asia to West Africa. And this was a huge blow both to the empire, the Ottoman Empire itself, and to Muslim communities in general across the Eastern Hemisphere, which includes Europe, Africa, and Asia. In the late 18th century, in the late 1700s, Sultan Selim III, the Sultan is the head of the Ottoman Empire, he began to use Western military advisors. And he saw what was going on in the West, in Europe, and recognized that he could use their input. So he started to use Western military advisors and the religious leaders in the Ottoman Empire and the elite janissaries. Again, remember, the janissaries are conscripted youth, usually from Christian families, who were taken and became high-ranking elite members of the Ottoman military. So the religious leaders and the elite janissaries from the Ottoman Empire argued against this intrusion of European military advisors into a really essential Ottoman Muslim center of power. They weren't interested in having outsiders come in to advise. Unfortunately for Sultan Selim III, in 1807 he was overthrown and murdered. So this just shows the really strong opposition to foreigners, especially Westerners, who were considered both infidels and barbarian-like for the majority of the Ottoman people. Starting in 1839, however, the Ottoman state engaged in widespread reform that was really quite defensive modernization, and this was called the Tanzimat era. Importantly, the Ottoman leadership established a lot of religious tolerance and legal equality for all people. And this is kind of interesting because you see a lot of influence that Napoleon had on creating more tolerance and equality for other members of a state within an empire. And this led to the promotion of various Christians into high office, which is somewhat unusual for a lot of chunks of the world. You don't normally elect or nominate or promote outsiders, people who have a different religious or political viewpoint, to high-ranking offices. And these reforms pursued a Western form of modernity, using law codes and court systems from Europe. So similar to a constitution, we'll talk about that in a moment. Also, they used technological infrastructure. They built up their technological infrastructure. The reforms also, interestingly, opened the door for women to greater access to public life. In general, prior to this, women were expected to be at home, and now they could walk outside and did not need a male guardian and did not need to cover their face and bodies as they had prior. The young Ottomans came into play in 1876, and they are considered Islamic modernism. They embraced Western technology and science and favored a more democratic style of rule with a constitution. And this is pretty phenomenal. However, democracy meant deciding how interpretations of the Quran and Sharia, which is Islamic law code, should rule. So their democracy wasn't so much a secular democracy. It was an Islamic Muslim democracy where people could choose how to interpret the Muslim laws on how to rule society. At the same time, the young Ottomans, and pay attention to the name here, young Ottomans, they rejected Western materialism, and their main goal was saving their Islamic community from European threats. So again, the young Ottomans are very Islamic. In 1876, the young Ottomans had a brief victory when their new sultan, their ruler again, Abd al-Hamid, accepted an elected parliament and constitution. So this is really quite an interesting movement towards liberalism in a sense, even though it was Muslim liberalism. However, he faced pressure from Russia and quickly returned to despotic rule for 3 decades. And a sort of side note, a despot is a ruler with absolute power and authority, and many times is violent and tyrannical, so very lacking democracy, to say the least. So the young Ottomans had a nice little play for a short time, and then returned to despotism. And the Young Turks came about in 1908, and the Young Turks are very interesting, very different from the Young Ottomans, so make sure you pay attention to the differences here. The military and civilian elites formed a movement based on secular modernism. They were frustrated with the renewed despotism of Abd al-Hamid and managed to seize power in a military coup in 1908. They pushed the Ottoman Empire towards an unapologetically European secular path to modernity. They established a radical secularization policy for schools, courts, and law codes, which, all considering, was very interesting, very Western, and very liberal in some ways. They opened up schools for women even, and made divorce easier for women to pursue, which was unheard of in most parts of the world at this time. Women were even allowed to wear Western-style outfits, which meant showing their arms and legs. And polygamy was restricted. Polygamy is when one man takes several wives, which was not super common, but definitely a normal part of the Islamic world for millennia, as it was in many parts of the entire Middle East for millennia. These are all things that most liberal Western democracies would appreciate. And the Young Turks had a proclamation for the Ottoman Empire in 1908, and I'm just going to read a few of those. It says that all Ottoman subjects having completed their 20th year, regardless of whether they possess property or fortune, shall have the right to vote. So anyone who is 20 years old or older can vote, even if they don't own property. And we've seen these types of ideas being provoked with the American and French Revolutions, saying, even though you're a man who doesn't own property, you still can vote. So the Ottomans are taking on these ideas as well. Another one is that the right to freely constitute political groups, so people can create and become part of political groups without being persecuted. And the Turkish tongue will remain the official state language. So the Turkish language is something that is very nationalistic, and we will see how the Young Turks turned towards nationalism and became very strongly focused on Turkish nationalism. And every citizen, here's another one, every citizen will enjoy a complete liberty and equality regardless of nationality or religion, and be submitted to the same obligations, which is interesting to read because we'll see something else that happens in just a moment. All Ottomans being equal before the law as regards rights and duties relative to the state are eligible for government posts according to their individual capacity and their education. Non-Muslims will be equally liable to the military law. So this is basically saying that anyone part of the Ottoman Empire has to follow the laws and will be regarded equally before the law, no matter the nationality or religion. And lastly, or not lastly, but the last one I'll read to you, is the free exercise of the religious privileges which have been accorded to different nationalities will remain intact. And part of this came from Napoleon when he started taking over different territories in the world, in the Eastern Hemisphere. He allowed anyone from different nationalities and different religions to practice whatever they believed in and whatever they wanted, as long as they were following the French law. On the other hand, unfortunately, the Turkish nationalism of the Young Turks movement antagonized and alienated non-Turks, including Arabs and Armenians. They were very, very anti-Arab, and towards the end became extremely anti-Armenian, sometimes very violently. The Armenians are a sect of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and it led to, in World War I, what was called, or what is called, the Armenian Genocide. And it lasted a couple years from about 1915 through 1917. And between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians were killed by Turks with the belief, based on propaganda and assertions, that the Armenians were siding with European powers, who were Allied powers during World War I. And the Allied powers were against the Ottoman Empire. As we will see, they forced the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and the Turks believed that the Christian Armenians were siding or would side with the Europeans, and basically committed a huge mass genocide. Today, Turkey has still yet to admit and apologize for this, which is, I don't even know how to express how insane that is, but that's what it is. And anyways, after World War I, the Young Turk movement set in motion the key principles for the post-World War I Turkish Republic, which became very stable and has lasted through today, with that very sad and unfortunate ding in their history with the Armenian genocide. This image shows the Young Turks, and kind of represents the first Ottoman constitution, which was created in 1895. And the banner up here reads "Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity," which is a French slogan. And what do we see here? There's an angel figure, first of all, who is holding up this wonderful slogan, "Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity." But center of the picture, there's a woman whose chains have been broken. Her chains have been broken. She's no longer chained, and these men are helping her rise up. And she represents not only women, but the Turkish nation in general, as the Ottoman Empire became more liberal and with a focus on nationalism, Turkish nationalism, but liberal for all people who were members of the Ottoman Empire. Again, here is an image. This is a more modern map compared to the last one that we saw. We can see that the territory has grown, especially right here in this area. And you see, starting in 1800, territory was being lost to other powers, to other European powers in particular, from 1800 till 1877, and then the orange is from 1878 till the beginning of World War I. And then the Ottoman Empire in right in the beginning of World War I was all the green stuff that was left. And after World War I, it was just Turkey, and it remains to be Turkey today. So the outcomes for the Ottoman Empire. In the space of a century, the once great Ottoman Empire was brought quite low by the forces of the industrialized West, and it became considered a semi-colony in the European informal empire. When the Ottomans pursued a policy of defensive modernization, they didn't really achieve a complete industrial transformation or real industrial growth, unfortunately for them. They did see a spread of Turkish nationalism as a motivating factor. It was unifying, with a uniting ideology, with broad popular appeal amongst the public people. People really liked the idea of becoming and being part of a Turkish state, Turkish stronghold. The Turkish Republic or state generally rejected Islamic tradition, but these practices, of course, and beliefs survived in the realm of popular culture. So people are still very Muslim in the modern Turkish empire, Turkish state, but the state itself has continued to be pretty secular. The empire collapsed in the early 20th century after World War I, or by the end of World War I, but the post-World War I Turkish Republic enjoyed and continues to enjoy pretty remarkable stability, which is pretty interesting. Okay, moving on to China in the east. So just to put this map into context, here's China, there's India, the Texas of the Asian hemisphere, Asian part of the world, because it kind of looks like Texas to me because I'm crazy. Anyways, Africa is down here and Europe would be over here if this map continued. Okay, so our focus question, let's review really quickly what we're going to be looking at here. And just to review, we're on chapter 19 in Ways of the World, but in order to answer this question properly and review and understand really the context of what happens here, there are parts of chapter 14 and 15 that should definitely be reviewed. And of course, look at the PowerPoint, look at the lecture, and there are primary source images that were assigned for this unit. So for this question, you need to assess at least 5 of these images. So here's our focus question. Why and how, or in what ways, did the Japanese and Chinese respond differently to Europeans from the 19th through the 20th centuries? So the 19th century is the 1800s, the 20th century is the 1900s. To answer this question, explain and assess what was happening in China and in Japan, including the wealth, power, and influence, etc., that both China and Japan had in East Asia and in the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Afro-Eurasia, or Africa, Europe, and Asia, before and after Europeans really came into the picture, which was the 19th and 20th centuries. As always, include the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why, and how and why important, and cite your sources. So we're going to do sort of a quick review of what was going on in China when the Europeans arrived. So China, in their Ming Dynasty, from 1368 till 1644, had the world's best goods like porcelain, silk, and technologies like the compass, and writing, and print, and gunpowder. All of these inventions really from what started in about 200 BCE before the Common Era up through 1800 of the Common Era. The Chinese were the most advanced in the world, and this definitely showed during the Ming Dynasty. They considered themselves the center of the universe. There were 5 directions: north, south, east, west, and center, which was China. And therefore, they would not recognize any outside ideas or anything from the West. If Europe had something that the Chinese didn't, they would say that the Chinese had invented it in the past and didn't need it any longer, so they didn't keep it. Isn't that entertaining? And they considered all other civilizations to be lesser and barbarian-like. There was the belief that trade with China was a huge privilege for others. And to trade, other people had to admit inferiority, that China was superior. And this was not a normal thing for Europeans to admit, but they did because they wanted those delicious goods from the East. China was very insular, meaning they did not want any information to come in or out of China, and information or people or goods really, in a lot of ways. And after Zheng He's travels in the early 15th century, the early 1400s, they really lacked interest in trading ideas and goods with outsiders because they considered themselves to have everything that they needed and everything that was good in the world. Some ideas that kind of go along with the idea of Chinese insularity are the Great Wall of China, which kept the northern Mongol barbarians out, and the Forbidden City in the city of Beijing. And the Forbidden City was a place that only nobility were allowed into. Commoners and foreigners were generally not allowed in. In about 1514 or 1513, the Portuguese arrived. And by 1559, the Chinese emperor allowed trade with the Portuguese in a factory, and that was a trading hub in the port city of Macau. And that's basically a place where there are soldiers to protect goods, and the goods and the traders and nothing else. Women and children, generally speaking, didn't go to those types of places. It wasn't a place to hang out, it was a place to trade and go away. And the Chinese wanted silver from the Westerners, from the Europeans. And of course, just as a reminder, silver came from the Americas that were stolen by the Europeans through basically slavery and land grabs. The Jesuit missionaries came into China as well, but they came in modesty, as we remember, I'm sure. Matteo Ricci, one of the Jesuit missionaries, he and his comrades studied Buddhism and Confucianism and became Confucian scholars. And he, especially Matteo Ricci, was esteemed in China and was even allowed into the Forbidden City, which again was very unusual for foreigners. And he brought with him European maps and books and clocks and technologies, and that's why he was allowed in. And he tried to convert the Chinese elite by kind of tweaking Christianity and saying that Confucianism wasn't a religion but a philosophy, so Christianity would be okay to add, and things like the Virgin Mary was ignored and communion was ignored because the idea of eating the blood and body of Christ was kind of seen as cannibalism in China or in the East in general. So they avoided these types of parts of Christianity. But even though they worked so hard to tweak Christianity to make it easier for the Chinese to absorb, they really failed to convert more than a few 100,000 people out of 300 million people, which was less than 1% of the population. And this was because of a few things. China's Ming and actually the Qing dynasty as well, they were economically, politically, and socially very strong, based on the ancient Confucian philosophy for the government and the elite people, and the religions of Buddhism or Taoism for the masses. So there was really no need for Christianity. Christianity was deemed rather annoying and threatening to Chinese culture. Another few examples: monogamy went against the idea of concubines and that ancient tradition of men having concubines to take care of. And also the Roman Pope wanted more control over his constituents, the Chinese Christians. And this was a huge threat and disrespect to the Chinese Empire and emperor. So Christianity was removed from the very powerful China. In the Ming Dynasty, there were a lot of failures because of heavy taxes on the peasants in silver. And this caused a lot of revolts over these taxes. Rather than being taxed in foodstuffs or things that they grew like rice or vegetables or meat, they now had to pay in silver. And if they didn't pay, their land was taken. So a lot of groups of poor people ended up revolting. They attacked the Beijing city, where the Forbidden City was located, and eventually a Ming general called upon the Manchurians, the Manchus from the north or far east, to protect Beijing. Unfortunately for the Ming rulers, the Manchus took over and created the Qing dynasty. Q is pronounced CH here. So it's not Q, it's Ch, so the Qing dynasty in 1644. And even though the Manchurians are Chinese, they were seen as foreigners. And in many ways, because of this, they were more open to trade with the Europeans. So there was a reversal of fortune, and there was a century of crises from within China that led to a great deal of problems from within the dynasty. First of all, there was dramatic population growth and pressures on the land, and that was thanks to its economic success and increasing agricultural output from foods and crops that came from the New World, from the Americas. China's population shot up from 100 million in 1685 to 430 million in 1853. So less than 200 years, the population went from 100 to 430 million people. This success creating a lot of environmental problems, looming environmental problems, as China began to run out of exploitable resources, things that could be used. Its expansion in the West was for defensive purposes to protect from Western invasion of ideas and culture, European in particular. And this expansion did not give China the rich New World windfall that Europe enjoyed from the Americas. And this led to poverty and unemployment and other social ills that began to grow in China. And the Qing dynasty was weakened in a lot of ways. The once efficient imperial centralized state bureaucracy did not grow to meet the demands of this larger population. It weakened when provincial leaders began to exercise more power and authority at the expense of the central state. So local leaders, provincial leaders, became more powerful. And soon it failed to properly collect taxes and keep up public works projects such as river control and granaries. The Huanghe, or the Yellow River, as popularly known as China's sorrow because of its devastating floods. And if they didn't have proper dams and other forms of river control, a lot of damage was done. And without granaries that are filled and overflowing, then years that there are floods or drought lead to famines for millions of people. And that's a huge, huge problem for the government system. And again, the Qing dynasty was Manchu and not ethnically Chinese, and this did not really help matters with the Chinese patriots. Additionally, Europeans wanted Chinese goods like black and green tea and silk and porcelain. Chinese, however, really only wanted silver from the Westerners, and when people like the British ran out of silver, they had to introduce a few other trade products in order to get those delicious goods from the East. And those included cotton and opium. Cotton was grown in India, and opium led to some challenges for the Chinese population. Challenges, to say the least. So here is a picture of an opium den in China. All sorts of people became addicted to opium. Men, women, students, court officials, soldiers going into combat, laborers working on industrial projects. Millions and millions of people were addicted to opium. And this led to a massive outflow of silver from China to the British to pay for opium. The Qing bureaucracy was weakened, and because of the trade influences of cotton and opium, due to the dramatic increase in Western, primarily British opium sales from China, from around 1,150-pound chests in 1773 to 23,000 chests in 1832, the Chinese government tried to take a firm hand against this illegal trade, and it was because it was creating so many addicts and draining China of its silver supply. And so they decided to talk to Commissioner Lin Zexu and had him attempt to stop the trade in China. Lin Zexu was nicknamed the Incorruptible because he was such a moral leader, and he was sent to the south part of China to stop the trade of opium. He seized the property of foreign drug smugglers, mainly British, and most of whom were wealthy and very established trading firms, and he destroyed numerous chests of the drug. And basically what he did was he dug a pit, he mixed lime and salt, and covered the pit of opium in salt water, and then eventually flushed it all down the river. And it took days to get rid of the chests that he took. And interestingly, he said a prayer to the environment to apologize for the disgusting pollution that was caused by doing this. In response to this outrage of having British property seized and its citizens held, the government sent a fleet, a British military fleet, navy, to punish the Chinese in what became the First Opium War. And this was from about 1838 till 1842. And of course, the British were newly industrialized with a brand new navy that had steel-hulled steamships with cannons. And because of this, the British were really able to achieve a number of victories, and they dictated the terms of the peace treaty in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing. And this was the first of several unequal treaties, and it opened up specific Chinese ports to the British merchants and restricted Chinese sovereignty. The Chinese no longer had total control of themselves, and other countries like France and Germany followed with their own unequal treaties. Here is an image of Commissioner Lin Zexu, the Incorruptible. And he was fighting Western narcotics trafficking, the opium that came in from the British. And again, remember, the Chinese were still very insular. They did not want any real outside influences, but there were a lot of pressures. Second Opium War, which was from about 1856 to 1858, saw the British vandalizing and looting the Summer Palace near Beijing, and that was just really seen as a huge slap in the face, plus other indignities. More ports were opened to British foreign traders who could now travel freely along Chinese waterways, and they could buy land in China, and they could preach Christianity freely, according to the government, and they could even patrol some rivers, meaning that they had military going up and down several rivers. On a sort of funny note, the Chinese couldn't use the symbol for barbarians when writing about the British in official documents, which was, I think of as pretty entertaining, because in the past they would say the barbarians in official documents in describing the British, and now they officially weren't allowed to use the term barbarians. This war was followed with more unequal treaties and a loss of territory in spheres of influence, such as Vietnam to France and Korea went to Japan. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. There were a lot of rebellions in the 19th century, the 1800s, but the largest by far was the Taiping Rebellion. And this was from about 1850 till 1864. The leader of the Taiping Rebellion, Hong Shihuang, rejected all traditional Chinese belief systems, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and instead he claimed he was the younger son of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to build a kingdom of heavenly peace, which is a very Chinese way of thinking and describing things, but the fact that he claimed that he was the younger son of Jesus Christ is very interesting. So this was a Christian movement. This radical movement was sort of socialist in its essence. It attacked traditional systems of property ownership, and there was a desire to abolish private property and redistribute land, which is a very socialist ideology. There was a desire for health insurance and education for all people, and to become an industrial nation with railroads, so modernizing. This movement also attacked patriarchy, with the desire to raise women's rights and roles, and of course this went strongly against traditional Confucian ideals, because Confucianism dictates that women are kind of belong and bound to the home, and instead this allowed a lot of freedoms and more rights to women. Foot binding, for example, was prohibited. We'll talk about that in a moment. And men and women were promised equal portions of land. Very interesting here. Women were also permitted to attempt the civil service exam, and this exam was needed to become a bureaucratic member or a government official. And women were now permitted to try to take this exam. It was an insanely intense exam, basically 3 days long, locked in a room, and a lot of people, there was like a little bottle of cyanide or some sort of drug that if you didn't take the exam well and you thought you were going to fail, you could kill yourself. That's how much stress was put on the importance and value of being successful with this exam. But women were now allowed and permitted to attempt the exam. And if they passed, they were appointed to supervisor positions. Of course, this was over other women, but still this is a brand new concept in China. And also, mutual attraction rather than family interests were the basis of marriage. So now it wasn't a matter of my family should become partners with that family over there. I have a daughter, they have a son, let's hook people up. Now it was based on mutual attraction. And keep in mind, this is a 14-year rebellion with some changes, but none of this was really consistent, and this period of Taiping power did not last very long, unfortunately, for these people, only 14 years or so. About 20 to 30 million people were killed, and eventually the central state failed to crush the revolt, so provincial gentry, the locals, the local elite, had to step in to put it down. And this reaffirmed the weakness of the Qing dynasty. The provincial gentry moved against the Taiping out of fear of the movement's radical social agenda. They did not like what the Taiping movement and the liberal reforms of the Taiping were doing, because old elites who are wealthy and powerful, generally speaking, don't like new liberal ideas to share power and wealth and land with other people. They like to keep their own power. So in the post-Taiping era, after the Taiping rebellion was put down, the gentry, the old elites, and the imperial authorities sought to impose a very conservative reaction. Old school, old ideas based on Confucianism, strict social hierarchy, and old ways of doing things, culture that had been around for millennia, not millions of years, thousands of years. And this delayed a serious effort at social reforms until the rise of the communists in the 1920s. So keep in mind, again, this is the middle of the 19th century, middle of the 1800s. And here's an image of the Chinese Taiping Rebellion. Taiping rebels captured the city of Nanjing in 1853, making it their capital. It wasn't until 11 years later, in 1864, that imperial forces, the government forces, retook the city, as illustrated in this Chinese print. And this effectively ended the Taiping uprising. So this is an image of a bound foot, foot binding. And it started with dancers and courtesans in the 10th and 11th centuries. And it became very popular during the Song dynasty. This was the dynasty that was around before the Ming dynasty in the 1300s. And it was for upper class women to do. Because what happened here, in order to create this lotus foot, that's what it's called, lotus, it's 7 centimeters, which is a few inches long. And that's an adult grown woman's foot. And this is seen as sexy and beautiful for men. And I kind of see this as similar to women getting breast implants or facelifts, or men getting calf implants or butt implants or whatever things people feel the need to do to beautify themselves for whatever sex they are attracted to. And unfortunately for women, this meant extraordinary pain because the foot was broken and the toes twisted inside. I'll show you an image of what it looks like when it's not bound. And a man would never see a woman's foot unbound. This picture here and the beautiful little silk foot is all that a man would see. Although the foot binding was really deforming and crippling women's feet, it was associated with aesthetic beauty when it was encased in this tiny and elaborately decorated shoe. So the foot binding destroyed the natural aesthetic of women's feet. It did create, in views of many Chinese, a new and decorative beauty. Interestingly, when there was a tightening of patriarchal order during the Song dynasty, women with bound feet were admired for their frailty and their daintiness. But this caused a great amount of disability, and it largely confined them to their home. And this meant that they needed servants for running errands and for doing housework. So it really became a symbol for upper class status, upper class women. It's really difficult to imagine that anyone with deformed feet could walk without pain or wear shoes other than these tiny and decorative little silk shoes. And the practice sought to reduce women to kind of decorative dolls in the cruelest way, or in what we would consider the cruelest way. Of course, this doesn't mean that women with bound feet fully embraced this submissive identity, but again, we have to kind of have historical empathy and realize that this was a natural and normal part of Chinese culture for hundreds of years. I'm going to show you an image of what this looked like when it was not bound, so brace yourself. Oops, here we go. So this woman has, she's an older woman, and she's washing her feet in a wooden vat, and you can see that her foot is kind of barely recognizable. The toes are here, and they're kind of pushed underneath and inward. Her foot was broken in order to make the foot into this type of size and position, and the rest of the foot is kind of pushed upward. And this deformity is the result of this ancient tradition of foot binding that, again, mostly wealthy young women in China were forced to submit to, and this usually started at a young age. Because it's extremely painful, and adults would not do as well at the breaking and disfiguring of the foot. Anyways, moving forward. By the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, the once powerful Middle Kingdom found itself in an informal empire, losing a lot of sovereignty, a lot of self-control, to Europeans, Americans, and Japanese, mainly because of Western pressures. Let's take a look at this map here. Look at where the Taiping Rebellion was centered. So this little map here shows the Taiping Rebellion here. So it took place in this region here. And the Boxer Rebellion to the north. So the Boxer Rebellion on this key in this map is up here. So again, this would be in this territory right over here. And look at the foreign influences in China in the 19th century, in the mid to late 1800s. The red is German, right here. Japanese colonies of Korea and Taiwan, we'll talk about that in a moment. Russian, and more Japanese here. British, Tibet, and this whole area right down here, and then French. So there are a lot of different colors here that show Europeans mainly jumping in to take over territory, plus Japan. A few more images here. This is called the Carving Up the Pie of China. And this image represents the European and Japanese power struggle over China. On the left is the British Queen Victoria. Next to her sits the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. To his left sits Tsar Nicholas II from Russia. And the Meiji Emperor of Japan is sitting next to him. The female figure standing behind Nicholas II represents France, and behind the entire group stands a man in Chinese dress and hair, raising his hands in protest. Wait! Of the Europeans, Queen Victoria and the German Kaiser are drawn in probably the least flattering way, these two over here. And the Japanese Emperor looks dark and brooding. The Russian Tsar looks handsome, however, and the woman representing France is kind of depicted as beautiful. And the artist was, no surprise, French and decided not to implicate his own country in this power grab, but instead idealized his nation in feminine beauty, even though France did participate in the scramble for territory in China. And the French alliance with Russia might have prompted the artist to draw the Tsar more generously. Probably least flatteringly depicted is the Chinese man with hands that kind of resemble claws and facial features that appear almost demonic, though you still kind of feel bad for that Chinese man. Despite the artist's demeaning characterization of the Chinese, he definitely stressed the unfair exclusion from the imperial rivalry over China. While these nations decided the fate of China amongst themselves, the poor Chinese people were seemingly helpless and unable to do anything about it, which is exactly what happened. Beginning in the 1860s and 1870s, a widespread movement of self-strengthening sought to reform and rebuild China, whereas Europe looked for good laws to govern men, the government in China looked for good men to rebuild and modernize, and that included the country's infrastructure, the exam system, and new industries, especially armaments, weaponry. But most modern industries were in the hands of foreign experts, such as European engineers and managers. The Qing dynasty did try to renovate the imperial system in 1898 with the 100 Days of Reform. And this is a program modernizing the traditional examination system and education system. So now people were studying math and science in addition to Confucian texts. And it eliminated sinecures, which were positions that provided little or no work but had a salary. And governments were changing from absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy with a democracy. They were applying the principles of capitalism to strengthen the economy, which is kind of interesting because they soon turned to communism, which is kind of in some ways the opposite of capitalism, and we'll see why that happened later. And they were focused on changing and strengthening the military to create a stronger military. They also led to rapid industrialization through manufacturing, commerce, and capitalism, The goal was to turn China into a modern and powerful nation. And the reformers declared that China needed more than self-strengthening, and innovation must be accompanied by institutional and ideological change. It wasn't just innovation, they needed a whole institutional change in order to compete with and keep up with the rest of the world. Conservatives in the government and landowners did not agree. For example, the Empress Dowager Cixi, a dowager is the widow of an emperor whose son then became the emperor. So Empress Dowager Cixi, her husband, the emperor, died, and her son became the emperor, and she was really the one kind of in charge who was telling her younger son what to do. She led a coup to return to conservative ways. Landowners, the wealthy, feared the changes posed by new industries and other forms of commercial modernity. They liked their power and they weren't really interested in other things. So the failure of the modernization movement was seen in the anti-foreign traditionalist movement known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Boxers, in the Boxer Rebellion, and this was from 1898 till 1901. When the Boxers, the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, when these people slaughtered Europeans and Chinese Christians and laid siege to the foreign embassies in Beijing, a multinational force, including Japan and other Western powers, invaded northern China. They crushed the Boxer Rebellion movement and exacted more humiliations as revenge, including payments, more foreign control by Japan and the West, and the Qing dynasty was once again further weakened. Faced with a foreign dynasty unable to reform the empire, intellectuals formed numerous popular nationalist groups that called for reform and argued against the Qing dynasty, against the foreign presence of European powers and Japanese, and against many traditional practices. And a new role for Chinese women was the subject of much debate. All of this led, with dwindling support from most sectors of society, and a bureaucracy unable to deal with these growing challenges. This all led to the 2,000-year-old imperial system that began with Qin Shi Huangdi, who called himself the first and only first Chinese emperor, collapsed from within by 1911. And what was established was the Republic of China that lasted from 1912 until after World War II in 1949. Okay, whew! That was China. Moving on to Japan. So China is here, and India would be further west of here, and here is Japan, this little island nation on the eastern part of the Eastern Hemisphere. And just to kind of show context, this is Korea and Taiwan, which is territory that was acquired by Japan in the early 1900s, after Japan became a pretty formidable power. This is just a little bit of review of Japanese history. The Japanese could pick and choose what they wanted from China. They were an island state and far enough from the mainland not to be overtaken by the Chinese, so they took on their own variety of religions and philosophies that they thought were best, and that included mainly Buddhism and Confucianism, and also they were influenced by Shintoism as well. There were devastating wars in the 1500s, in the 16th century, between the daimyos, who were feudal lords, or basically heads of clans based on wealth. Whoever could produce a certain amount of rice per year would be the leader. And these daimyos, rival clans, caused civil war in China. And they each daimyo had samurai that made up about 6% of the population. And the samurai were professional soldiers as the military branch of the daimyo, under their leader and under the religious leaders of their clans. there was also an emperor, and I put him in quotation marks because even though he had the great and most powerful title of emperor, the power of the emperor was really a symbolic role, and he was relegated to his palace in Kyoto, and he did not really have a lot of influence or power in Japan at all over the years. The Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century. After the devastating civil wars of the 16th century, the 1500s, a Tokugawa shogun, who was a military leader, not an emperor, he got a hold of Portuguese guns and plenty of silver, and by 1603 established himself as the leader of the over 200 regional feudal lords, who again are called daimyo. And this Tokugawa shogunate carried out a number of significant policies. The Tokugawa, first of all, placed the samurai class above the commoners, the farmers, the artisans, the merchants, and they enacted sumptuary laws which limited hairstyle and dress and accessories of all social classes, which, if you think about that today, is kind of entertaining to think about, because anyone here at any time could wear whatever they wanted, whereas in Japan, in the early 17th century, from the 1600s forward, people could only wear certain things at certain times, if depending on who they were and their social class. In addition, the Tokugawa shogunate, the now basically military leadership of Japan that was in power, they made all professions hereditary, which meant that if one person was an artisan, their children would be an artisan. And if one person was a samurai, a military warrior, then their children would also be samurai warriors. They organized commoners into groups of 5 and held all people responsible for the acts of each individual. And this really helped enforce the idea of becoming good people, because everyone was watching you, and your neighbors would tell on you, because if your neighbor saw something, or if you did something that was wrong and your neighbor didn't stop you, he would be punished as well. In order to prevent the daimyo, the other 200 plus regional feudal lords, from rebelling, the shoguns required the daimyo to maintain lavish residences in Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, which is a derivative of Tokugawa. And these daimyo were forced to live in these residences in Edo on a rotating schedule on alternate years. And they were also forced to carry out expensive processions to and from their domains, and to contribute to the upkeep of shrines and temples and roads, and they had to seek permission before repairing their castles. And all of this ensured that they couldn't gain local loyalty enough to overtake the Tokugawa. Tokugawa decided to outlaw European guns, and this was to prevent a threat from other daimyo, those feudal lords. So they came up with the idea that real samurai had to use traditional weapons or swords. And then eventually they banned fighting altogether, and this was of course to keep power for themselves. Additionally, the Tokugawa outlawed Christianity to keep unification within Japan, mainly for political reasons. And the Japanese kicked the Christians out because, first of all, according to Christian philosophy, all are equal in the eyes of God. And this idea was a huge threat to the feudal system with social, political, and economic, and military hierarchy that had been custom to Japan for millennia. There was also a fear that Japanese Christians might join European Christians living in Japan, and with the help from or support from abroad, they would unite to go against the Tokugawa shogunate. So this was considered a threat. And there was also Japanese knowledge of Europe's wars, Protestants against Catholics in Europe, and both are sects of Christianity. And the fear in Japan was that Christians might cause a split within Japan, making Christians go against the Buddhists, Taoists, and Confucianists. So Japan really just wanted to remain unified in culture and people without an extra challenge of a different religion. As a side note, today approximately 1% of Japan identifies as Christian out of a total population of about 127 million people. So maybe about 1.2 million people in Japan are Christian. This Tokugawa system put an end to the previous civil war and bloodshed by breaking the daimyo in location allegiance and forbidding the samurai to fight. And all of this led to about 2.5 centuries of peace in what became known as the peaceful state from about 1603 till 1867. So it was really closer to 265 years. And they eventually outlawed all foreign traders except for the Dutch. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. But basically, this prolonged peace allowed Japan and the economy to flourish. And this resulted in increasing urbanization. People moved to cities, with Edo, which became Tokyo, reaching 1 million people, with a total population of over 31 million at this time. The spread of a dynamic commercial sector with a developing industry also developed, and a huge agricultural business with 80% rice farmers, and widespread literacy. About 40% of men and 15% of women learned how to read, which is incredible at this time. Cultural achievement was really high during this period, and many artistic developments took place. The most significant among them were the wood block prints and theater, including kabuki and banraku theaters. Look those up, really interesting. Nevertheless, though the economy was growing and the country was pacified, it was not unified because the daimyo lords had a lot of independent power and autonomy in their own domains. This is the first shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. And here are a few images of samurai. I'm sorry, the one to the right is kind of blurry. I made it bigger and it made it blurry, but I wanted you to see that these are photographs. Japan got photography by the 1800s, and so these are samurai of the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1800s. They're black and white pictures, but they're colored in, which I think is hilarious, but also awesome because it kind of gives us a sense of what these people might have been actually wearing with color. This is a drawing, but you can still tell the very elaborate and colorful uniforms that the samurai would wear, in addition to their horses, of course. And this is another photograph, and these are Bushi warriors at the end of the Tokugawa era. And one more. I think this might be my favorite image because their uniforms are just magnificent. Longbows and swords. Real warriors. Again, Japan was isolationist. After the earlier spread of Christianity and Western weapons, like guns in the early 1500s, the Tokugawa leadership decided to close their ports to the west, and only the Dutch were allowed to visit a small port in the island in the south once a year in Nagasaki, which on this map is right down here. And there was very limited contact with the West in general. In the 1800s, as American merchants and whalers began to sail in the Pacific, the Japanese imprisoned or executed any sailors who came ashore, and that was either on purpose or via shipwreck. Could you imagine? You're in the frickin' middle of the ocean, you shipwreck, and you see land, and you're so grateful, and there are people alive there, and you swim ashore, and they either imprison you or execute you right away. And being imprisoned generally meant death because people were not taken care of in a way that people in our prisons today are, with meals and clean showers and rooms, etc. So Nagasaki was that port. It was not even a factory, it was just a port where only the Dutch were allowed to trade. And this was in part because the Dutch were Protestant and did not proselytize. They did not preach or try to convert the Japanese people, but more so because of what was called Dutch learning. The Dutch brought books that provided a vision of the outside world, European art and philosophy and shipbuilding and weaponry making, which was really important to Japan. Only leaders and a few others were allowed to look at these European books, and a tiny bit of Japanese culture was allowed out with some of the goods that were being traded. There was increasing social instability because wealth spread throughout Japanese society, and some lower status peasants began to be able to afford the trappings of the elite. And widespread corruption and failure of the government to respond to a major famine in the 1830s, for example, this encouraged various revolts and uprisings, including the attack on merchants and the burning of Osaka in 1837. And also remember, the samurai are really high ranked, and they are not allowed to fight. The samurai that belong to each daimyo feudal lord, they have really high social status, and they are not allowed to fight. They don't have jobs, in a sense. And then these little lower class, gross people, the merchants, who were considered the lowliest of low in Japan, they became very wealthy and were all of a sudden giving loans out to the samurai that were way higher in class. These caused some social instabilities to emerge. Let's take a look at some pictures that are kind of important here. This is an image on the left here are steamships. The black smoke, steam and coal-fired steamships, and on the right is an image of the U.S. Commodore, the leader of this great fleet, and his name was Matthew Perry, who is not the same Matthew Perry who was on Friends, who is adorable. This is a general, a Commodore, a leader of the U.S. Navy, and in 1853 he was sent by the United States of America to open up Japan. And they sent this fleet of coal-burning ships to Tokyo Bay. And Matthew Perry gave an ultimatum and a white surrender flag to the Japanese leaders. And the Japanese were aware of what the British had done in China, and seeing these very intimidating ships that billowed thick black smoke and had cannons aimed at Tokyo Bay, the Japanese capitulated and let the Westerners into the islands. Perry opened trade with Japan for Western influence with this big fleet of tankers with heavy weaponry. The Industrial Revolution did well for Westerners, and he and his men were hated by the Japanese for forcing Japan to open its isolationist borders. And here is a drawing of the black ships. There were 9 of these coal-fired steamships that carried 1,800 men and over 100 cannons, and they became known as their black ships because of the smoke. They weren't actually painted black. And this is, I think, a kind of entertaining image of Matthew Perry, the U.S. General, the U.S. Commodore, and his second-in-command. And notice that they both have kind of unsightly features. Their eyebrows and noses seem oversized. Their skin looks wrinkled and sickly. Their hair is receding and unappealing. And they also look very similar, which is kind of the way it is, because all white people look alike. That was a joke. Ha ha ha. It's clear that this artist did not really like Commodore Perry and his mission. Based on the angry expressions on the men's faces, the artist must have considered them rude and boorish. The uniforms of the officers are not very detailed, which suggests that the artist was not impressed by the Americans' regalia. What a kind of horrifying image of these two people. Here are a few more versions of U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry. This is an image of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1867. So this is just some 13-14 years after the Americans arrive, and you can see how Western influence has come into Japan in a very strong way. Quite tremendously, actually. He's wearing a French military uniform, and this just really shows the quick level of influence the West had on parts of Japanese culture. And in this case, it was the shogun, the head of basically Japan. And this was right before what was called the Meiji Restoration era, which we'll talk about in a moment. And these are French military advisors in a mission to Japan to modernize Tokugawa Yoshinobu's forces. They were invited by Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, to help him modernize. The social instability between the classes, plus the corrupt Tokugawa leadership, plus the failure to keep the Western barbarians out, turned into a perception of Japan being weak, and this led to the notion of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, with a lot of anti-West sentiment. In addition, even though the samurai class was very high in social status and had a lot of privileges, they had no occupation because they were not allowed to work, to prevent warring between the daimyo feudal lords. And this caused a lot of social instability between the classes. And again, the samurai were challenged because they were warriors with a hereditary status, but there were no wars to fight within Japan, so they became bureaucrats and accountants for their daimyo lords. And they held high social status but had very little wealth and no way to prove their valor, their bravery. So merchants at the same time were vilified in Japanese kind of culture, and they were increasingly wealthy and again often loaned money to their social superiors. So this had a lot of bad social challenges within Japan. And on the other hand, these young samurai learned about the West through Dutch learning. They looked to the West to find innovation and business ideas and jobs and new technologies, and they advocated for Western industry but with Japanese and samurai culture. And their sentiment was learn West, think East. We've seen this before, we'll see this again. All of this led to civil war in Japan, and it ended with what was called the Meiji Restoration era, which began in 1868. And this was the controlled restoration of imperial rule by the younger Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu were ex-samurai from the southern part of Japan who learned from the West to become big business leaders. And they removed the last Tokugawa shogun, and they created a nation-state focused on the return of one leader who was considered to be a descendant of the earlier gods. And that one leader was the emperor, but he was a puppet figure. He was 15 years old, and his advisors were the Zaibatsu, who were the former samurai. The Zaibatsu embarked on a course of modernization, which included legal reform, industrialization, and other pretty profound changes. Their quest to modernize had several distinct advantageous conditions. The Meiji Restoration wiped the slate clean without massive destruction or violence, which was pretty interesting to think about. Japan was completely changing their ways without a major war, as was seen in the United States, which was very preoccupied at the time with the Civil War and its aftermath. And the Europeans were not really interested in Japan as compared to China or the Ottoman Empire, which was very strategically significant in location. And because the United States was occupied with a civil war, Japan kind of had extra advantages over Japan and the Ottoman Empire. Image of the Meiji Emperor, the 15-year-old kid who became the emperor at the time of the Meiji Restoration era, who of course was guided by the Zaibatsu. The Meiji Restoration era had a lot of modernization and centralization. The modernization, again, was a defensive program, as we've seen in other parts of the East, and it was designed, like in China, to stave off Western penetration, but the changes were really revolutionary and dramatically remade Japan in the duration of a generation, within a few decades. Importantly, the Meiji reforms created a coherent and centralized Japanese state out of the former feudal regionalism of the Tokugawa shogunate, with the separated daimyo. Instead, it became very centralized and controlled by the emperor and his men, the Zaibatsu. The system was again led by the Zaibatsu and that figurehead or puppet emperor. And the Zaibatsu formed the true oligarchy of Japan, and they were really responsible for Japan emerging as the leading military industrial power in Asia by the early 20th century, by the early 1900s. Their first task was to dismantle the old Confucian Tokugawa-era social order. The daimyo lords were replaced with authorities from the centralized state, so people who were loyal to the emperor and the Zaibatsu were put in charge of the local territories across Japan. And the samurai class was disbanded. They lost their special privileges and social prestige, including the right to wear swords. Now other people could wear swords as well. Indeed, the Japanese all became commoners, equal citizens before the emperor. And we see this theme throughout the 20th century, especially in places like Russia or the Soviet Union, where everyone is all of a sudden called comrade rather than high-ranking official names. However, there were accountants, bureaucrats, and administrators, and hierarchy, with most elite Japanese who found prestigious jobs in the new national military or growing government sector. And they still kept their wealth and power, as we see across the globe. Even changes that are supposed to really help everyone, generally speaking, end up only helping the already powerful and wealthy. And this, of course, included the Zaibatsu, the ex-samurai. They brought more industrialization with French military advisors, British Navy advisors, and American advisors for public and popular education, which is interesting to think about. Japan was influenced in many ways by Western popularities, so to speak. One of the men who popularized Western learning, technology, and social mores was Fukuzawa Yukuchi. And he represented the early enthusiasm for everything Western, including dress, dancing, and education. Anything that came with the West was good, and he and people like him really admired the West and wanted to become like the West. However, after an initial period of wholesale adoption of all things Western, the Japanese began to select certain aspects of the West and fuse them with various cultural traditions, ancient traditions. One example of that is the Meiji Constitution. It was modeled on the German Constitution, but stated that it was a gift from the emperor who descended from the sun goddess. So there's kind of an interesting old school twist. And also the universal education system blended Western science with Confucian ideology. So Japan was still able to retain central Japanese values and traditional ideas. And again, the idea here was Western thinking, Eastern values, or learn West, think East. Let's look at a few images here. Image is a railroad, and it displays the modernization in Japan. As in Europe, railroads really quickly became a popular symbol of the country's modernization. And this is a woodblock print from the 1870s. This woodblock print from 1887 is titled Illustration of Singing by the Plum Garden, and it shows a mix of Japanese and Western culture. There are plum trees in the background that are Japanese culture or lifestyle. And the writing up here on the right is Japanese. And the women are wearing layered dresses that are very European in style, but are also layered, which was a traditional Japanese culture to layer dresses, layer kimonos. Their hairstyles, on the other hand, and the puffy dresses, and the carpet, and the piano, and the building structure, and the furniture, and the violin, and the rail over here in the background. That is all Western influenced. Interesting image, I think. Very colorful. And this show is monkey men, in a sense. By the 1870s, not all Western ideas were appreciated. What it says at the bottom is monkey show. All the monkeys are dressed in European style and in every respect are trying to ape the foreigners. The image was created in 1879 and it depicts Mr. Morse, who was an American zoologist who introduced Darwin's theory of evolution to Japan in 1877, and it explains that all human beings were monkeys in the beginning. And the artist says, in the beginning, but even now, aren't we still monkeys? When it comes to everything Western, we think the Redbeards are the most skillful at everything. Well, he clearly did not agree with many Japanese who thought that the Westerners were so skilled at everything. To ape is to copy or imitate, and this artist literally took that and created the idea and the image of Japanese aping Westerners by dressing like them, and he kind of, in a semi-funny way, turned the Japanese people into monkeys because they were imitating the Westerners. The Meiji Restoration opened up new possibilities for women, and there were a few figures who began to explore a feminist alternative for Japan. However, like most states at this time, Japan was unwilling to give women any political rights and banned them from joining parties well into the 1920s, which is similar to most parts of Europe and America as well. The Japanese industrialization process was quick and very successful in many ways. However, it did create a lot of suffering at the lower end of the social strata. Peasants found life increasingly difficult and often sold their daughters to support themselves. Many of these girls went into the textile industry where they worked long hours for very low wages and lived in unpleasant factory dormitories where they didn't have freedom to go anywhere or think for themselves because they were really slaves in a sense. In opposition to this new industrial order, which is similar to what we were seeing in places like Britain and other parts of the world like America, where these peasant people, lower class people were worked to the bone, there was a new social order with radical leftists, liberals that began to flirt with socialism and anarchism. Socialism is an idea that the government is meant to support the people and there should be more economic equality. And anarchism is the desire for a much smaller government role. In 1911, a feminist anarchist, Kanosuga, was hanged for allegedly conspiring to kill the emperor. Kind of interesting stuff here. Oops, sorry about that. So there were wars that propelled Japan to power. The Sino-Japanese War in 1895 created a new industrial Japanese force to fight against China, and this really propelled Japan into a military power thanks to industrialization with ideas from the West. So Sino is China, Sino-Japanese, so Chinese-Japanese War in 1895, and this really propelled Japan to become a military power. And then, the Japanese Treaty of 1902 between the British and the Japanese, and this was the first of a series of revisions of unequal treaties between Japan and the West, and this indicated that Japan was now to be treated as a sovereign and modern nation that was quite powerful, and this really signaled a diplomatic victory of the Meiji era for the Japanese. And then the Russo-Japanese War. Oops, here we go. 1904 to 1905, the Japanese fought over Manchuria, which is in China, against the Russians. And this is the map of Manchuria in red up here, and the yellow is China. And it was a really big battle with steel-hulled ships. And Japan defeated Russia, a Western empire, using Western technology. These wars with China and with Russia and the Anglo-Japanese Treaty really showed that Japan was now a modern military power, and its defeat of Russia especially was noteworthy as the first defeat of a major European power in the recent era of imperialism. This was powerful stuff. And here's an image of the war with Japanese steel-hulled ships fighting against the Russians with cannons, all Western technologies. Thanks to its victories in these wars, Japan decided to engage in its own empire building and started with Manchuria. Then, from 1895 till 1945, in East Asia, this newly industrialized Japanese empire decided to flex its muscles by annexing the island of Taiwan and the Korean peninsula from China. Then Japan engaged in a style of colonialism similar to the European examples. They were brutal and cruel and did not treat the colonized peoples of Taiwan and Korea in a humane way. Many Taiwanese and Koreans preferred European colonialists because they were deemed more gentle than the Japanese. And that says something, because we've seen the extraordinary brutality that is Western imperialism in other parts of the world. At the same time, the Japanese got a lot of admiration from the colonial world. Those colonized by Japan definitely would disagree due to the high degree of brutality, but many people from Poland in Europe to the Dutch East Indies south of China looked to Japan with hope and inspiration that Japan was a symbol of standing up to the West, standing up against European superpowers, which of course included the United States of America, even though America is on the Western Hemisphere. And here are some images of the Russo-Japanese War over Manchuria, which again was in China, and the colonization of Korea here and Taiwan down here. And here's just another upper closer image, up close image, and you see in red all of the railroads that Japan built. And the symbols here are major industrial areas, and it just shows that Japan was really covered in new infrastructure and industrialism pretty early on in the game. The first non-European, non-Western power to take industrialization on its own and develop as a huge power in the world. Okay, again, our focus question. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me. I hope you enjoyed the Unit 8 lecture. Cheers!